Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hispanics and Philanthropy's Book Charla. We'll be having an exciting conversation today around Impacto Real, las nuevas economías del cambio social. I'll be your host, Ramfis Castro. I'm a partner and advisor for the PowerUp Fund, which is focused on enabling a more equitable access to capital, an initiative by Hispanics and Philanthropy supporting better capital access for Latino entrepreneurs. There will be real-time translation as part of the talk today. So today, I'm extremely excited for the conversation that we're going to have in a few minutes. I'll let kind of folks continue to kind of come in. The two women that we'll have today as part of the Hispanics and Philanthropy's efforts of sort of Women's Month are inspirational figures to me. Right, both of them are experienced investors, some of them entrepreneurs, and I'm just excited to kind of hear kind of what they have to talk and say with each other. So first, I'll introduce Nathalie Molina Niño. Nathalie is an investor. She's an author of LEAPFROG and a book about how to, essentially sort of a book around, sorry, kind of a little bit nervous everyone. So I guess this is sort of part of conversation. So Nathalie is a friend investor, impact investor, and just been sort of a powerhouse, just really inspired by all her work supporting movements in terms of reallocation of capital around impact investing and the gender lens investing, and all her work supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs across the board and around the world. And also want to introduce Morgan Simon, who literally kind of wrote the book that I use on my journey of aligning my investment with values, Impacto Real, which I'll let them kind of talk about. So excited to have them both up to speak.
Yay, love you, Ramfis. You are one of the few people that reminds me how much I miss seeing people.
I do. I mean, this is for everyone. This is the first time I'm caught up with Nathalie in a while, so I'm just thankful to see. And Morgan, actually, the last time we were all together, Morgan and myself, was in Puerto Rico like close to a year ago. So I'm just really excited. There's so much has happened. The world is different, but there are also things that are the same. And the conversation that you both will have, I'm just excited to kind of learn from you both. I'm inspired every day what I see and all the achievements, and just really calling truth to power, right? Outcomes over optics, as Nathalie loves to say, right? And that's the thing I appreciate the most, is just making sure that people align their capital with their rhetoric. So I'm really excited to have you both, and thankful we can carve out time to share your insights and your experiences with us.
Yay, gracias. All right, hey Mama, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day. And just really excited to connect with this community. As you know, there's just so many ways to make change and so much work to do. And I think that that's, part of what, even having a new administration come in, of all the opportunities that's opening, and looking at the intersection of politics and economy and spirituality and all these different areas that we have to work in, just makes it an extra exciting time to be doing this work. Yeah. How are you?
I'm good. I'm always happy when Hispanics and Philanthropy, despite all of my raging against philanthropy, invite me to talk, to do anything with them. I'm so proud of the work that they do, and the organizers are so well organized and thoughtful, and they've given us like a series of topics and things that they want us to cover, but they made the mistake, or maybe the positive thing, who knows, we'll see at the end of this, of telling us right before we got on the call that we can also just go off the cuff. So we will be doing that for sure. Listen, one of the things that we obviously, it's like a baseline to any conversation, and it's very different when you are talking about it. And that's what I love about this, is that the question of sort of what is impact investing, there's so many different answers to it. And as Ramphis mentioned, I'm all about outcomes over optics. And if that's the frame, like 90% of the answers that I hear are not anything I'm interested in. They're really not. And oftentimes my personal experience with it is I am absolutely an impact investor, as I think you and others would define it, but I often don't use the word because it's so often confused with philanthropy, or with concessionary returns all the time, whatever that even means, right? And so there's a lot of confusion, and there are just few people on this planet who can speak with as much depth and authority, and who frankly wrote the book about it and now in Spanish. So I guess with all of that preamble, I want everybody sort of listening and watching to know that, like, this is not your typical, hey, what is impact investing? This is, hey, what is impact investing, from the woman who is incredibly discerning and wrote the book about it. So can we sort of start there?
Sure. So I've spent 20 years doing impact investing. Actually, next year will be my 20th year, which is pretty crazy. Wow. And, the last 8 has been as founding partner at Candide Group. So we've put over 125 million to work in 90 investments, the majority led by women and people of color. So just in terms of that's kind of the day-to-day work that I'm doing and how I enter the field.
Yeah.
So, but
I don't know anybody who can say that, by the way.
Well, I think there are many people who may say that, but it goes back to, the word impact. The Merriam-Webster definition of impact is to impinge upon, especially forcefully. And that doesn't sound good, right? Like, that doesn't sound like I want to be part of the impinge upon people movement. So this question of how do we do impact investing in a way that is really shifting power, and transforming historic relationships, that's a very specific piece of impact investing. But before we even get into that, knowing, coming out of a philanthropic world, this question of not only what is impact investing and why should I care? Why is this relevant to the work that I'm doing? So when I think about social change, and I mentioned the spiritual just because I think the crisis of empathy, right? You need people to care, period. If we can get there, then it's how does the broader culture change? How does politics shift? And how does the economy shift? And you cannot solve any economic issue if you're not willing to dive in on investing. And that's part of why, my book is really written in a way that you could have zero finance background and be able to dive in, because I think it's important for us to really own our money, right? That I think what often happens both as individuals or in the context of a foundation, once the money goes over the fence to a bank or a financial advisor, we act like it's not ours anymore. And we forget
or
that
even an
money,
alum of a university, or even
Absolutely.
a member of a union that has a pension fund. We don't believe that we have control when we really do.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's why this idea of, if we're trying to align our money and our values, right? So let's say in the context of a foundation, you might be engaging in cultural strategies and political strategies, right? Like through your donations, which is going to be typically a 5% payout a year. And then there's this 95% that's hanging out. Right. And what's really interesting to me, I've done a lot of work specifically around the private prison industry. And I think part of this is that impact investing to me kind of has two sides. One is that you need to build the world that you want to see. And that's when we're doing things like investing in utility scale solar on the Navajo Nation, or co-ops that are led by formerly incarcerated women, right? There's so many amazing projects that can make money and make social change at the same time, which is kind of the defining definition of impact investing. But when we think about, like, why would you do this, right? When we're talking from a philanthropic angle. So let's say I'm an immigration funder and that I have been donating to organizations that are working on closing detention camps and really working towards a more just immigration policy that isn't so dependent on locking people up. And it just so happens
feel
that
familiar to a lot of people, I hope, in this community, right? I mean, this is an issue that is near and dear to our hearts, and getting, more and more visible and prominent.
Right. So then when we do the kind of basic power mapping, right, as good organizers around any issue of, like, why is this happening? Why is it that over 80% of immigrants are held in for-profit detention centers? In the case of people may recall, there's been recent controversy over the potential reopening of the homestead child facility, which was making as much as $750 a night. Like, you might as well have been putting these kids in the Ritz-Carlton, right? But instead, we're letting these private corporations profit off of this suffering. So that's kind of the lay of the land. And it might be that people are organizing to stop those detention centers. But if you're at a foundation and you haven't checked if you have companies like CoreCivic and Geo Group invested in your endowment, you might be funding more money to the problem than you are to the solution, right? If you have millions of dollars that are invested in the companies that are actually owning and operating these detention camps, then whatever philanthropy you're doing, given that 95% of your money could be invested in the problem, 5% in the solution, don't be surprised when you lose. Right? It's very, very basic. So I think from that perspective, this idea of we have to fight for social change with every dollar that we have, and that we might get to vote every 4 years, but where you spend or invest your money is the vote that you get to take every day. And we need to think about that both in terms of philanthropy, which I feel is kind of, I think the other is you need to think about what type of money, or people sometimes say like flavors of money, is best suited to solve which problems. So organizing and advocacy, philanthropy is a great tool for that, right? Whereas if I'm trying to address the terrible behavior of corporations, or if I'm trying to build an economy with greater ownership in communities of color, then I'm going to use investing as my tool, right? So really expanding that toolkit, I think, is really critical. And that's where, like, yes, impact investing is this idea that you can align your money and your values. You can make investments that are in things that are positive rather than negative. But I also want to go broader and say this is a social change strategy. And that's why I think it's really critical for people in philanthropy to be thinking through that lens as another tool in their toolkit.
And I have to say, I want to move into the idea that I think people don't know how the sausage gets made. So a lot of the times it's not a choice of I'm not going to use, my influence, the capital I touch, it's just a question of not actually knowing how the sausage gets made. And so not realizing that these levers are there. And that's why I think that your book is so important. That's why I think the fact that the book is now translated in Spanish is so important. And I want to go there. But before I do that, we're going to go off the cuff a little bit. You mentioned, as you sometimes do, I'm involved, you said, in private prisons. We're going to need to pause. We're going to need to pause. And if anybody is not following Morgan, if you have not seen, for example, the amazing Newsweek investigative journalism piece that was written on not just Morgan, but the whole coalition that she is a part of and the work that they did, she had one of the largest private prisons sue her. I mean, you've done amazing work. So I guess before we just kind of gloss over that, can you at least give folks listening and watching a little bit more insight into what you mean by I work with that issue?
Sure. So essentially the briefest version is that basically, I want to situate this in terms of how we think about money and activism. So we take an issue like, I want to stop the fact that America incarcerates more people than any other country on the planet and has the largest immigrant detention kind of infrastructure of any country, and that companies make profit off of this. And that's ridiculous, right? So let's start there. Then let's say I'm an investor. What can I do? First is making sure to be in alignment and accountability with grassroots communities, right? So we are part of the Families Bond Together Corporate Accountability Committee. We were brought in by Presente.org. We actually share office space. So really, we've always made sure as investors to co-locate with activists and try to support that work holistically. And they have been looking at, well, who is funding these detention centers? And came to me saying, Morgan, can you help us, as you said, Nathalie, kind of figure out how this sausage is made and how can we unravel it? And basically, in part of this coalition work, we, over the last couple of years, were successful in getting 10 banks, or rather in the wake of this activism, 10 banks made a commitment to stop funding private prisons. And
Thanks.
that was, JP Morgan, BNP Paribas, Wells Fargo, big name banks that represented, I think, 87.4% of financing to the industry. So it was pretty major. And we saw over this past year, private prison stocks fell by over half. Biden's recent executive order, which, by the way, covered it at the Department of Justice, but not Department of Homeland Security yet. So that is something that people are really organizing hard on. But I essentially, in doing this work and then writing about it, because I'm a senior contributor to Forbes.com, I'm often writing about the intersection of money and social justice, helping people understand that behind every social justice issue, money either is a friend or a foe, right? And you need to understand what it's doing. So I was writing about this work, and CoreCivic sued me and my company, claiming I caused them as much as $60 million of damage, which is a big number. Basically, they sued me for saying that prisons separate families. That's the headline. It's pretty hilarious to me because, by the way, prisons do separate families.
Every kind of prison.
Just in case there was any kind of, and I think, honestly, it's been really important as we enter this kind of next phase of organizing. People often associate the idea of family separation with the Trump family separation policy of 2018. But every time someone goes into an immigrant detention center or into a prison, they are separated from their family, right? And I think that this is where expanding empathy, we're at this really interesting moment. You finally got Americans to care about kids in cages. Okay, well, how about adults in cages? How about kids who are on the outside waiting for their parent to get out of cages, right? So that's where, in the journalistic context, so I've written about, for instance, Antonio Medina, who's a Marine in New York, who's currently out giving COVID vaccines at Yankee Stadium, while his dad is stuck in an immigrant detention center, and has been for quite some time now. So I think, at any rate, this is a long way of saying that I think that investing and activism absolutely go together. That's probably not the typical story you would expect to hear from someone who is a founding partner of a registered investment advisory, right? But I think that's where we have this opportunity to say, whatever your funding issue might be as a philanthropist, have you done that power mapping of how does investing impact your issue? And then can you, as they say, jump over the fence or go to the next floor, whatever it is, to talk to who's managing the endowment of your institution. And is this a conversation that you've had about how do we connect what's happening on the philanthropic side with the endowment side, or in the context of family philanthropy or otherwise. So at any rate, that's the story around private prisons. And
people need to just get used to this, right? I mean, I think that confusion of, or not confusion, that idea of people wanting to have people stay in their lanes, right? I was very active last year as well. And it was like, what are you doing getting involved in politics? It's like, none of my investments matter. None of my investments are going to do anything productive, either for returns in terms of monetary returns or in terms of the impact I'm trying to make if we don't have a functioning democracy. So yeah, you better believe I'm going to get involved in saving democracy if I can. But for some reason, that's a challenge, and people want to, as I said, keep people in their lane.
Well, and I think also finance, part of its function, I've been thinking lately, reflecting on, what's the movie with Kevin Spacey, Kaiser Soze, The Usual Suspects.
Yes.
And the big line from that movie is, the greatest trick that the devil ever did was convincing us that he didn't exist, right? And I think in that same way, that finance kind of convinces us that, just let the finance people handle it. Don't
the
worry,
invisible hand, the intelligent, free market that just sort of figures everything out on its own.
And that is, 90% led by white men, right? So I think that's the other element of how women and people of color have been historically excluded, even from the knowledge, right? And intergenerational knowledge connected to that, and then from ownership. And I think that's where, we certainly know that things are not going to shift if we don't start looking at who owns the infrastructure for this, and can start to really infuse greater equity into our practices. So that's another piece in the context of the book of profiling a number of projects, two of which are in Latin America, in terms of talking through like what are the mechanisms as investors that we could actually do to transfer ownership. But I know that this is also an issue that's been very near and dear to your heart. So I'm curious, like how that's been entering your thinking as an investor lately?
I mean, you and I were involved and worked very closely, right, to get access, for example, in a very pragmatic way, PPP loans to all of the Black and Brown owned small businesses, so many, Latinx businesses that were locked out, right? In some cases, they were banking with their bank for decades, and they assumed that, their bank that they've known forever was going to hook them up with the PPP loan. And these banks were saying that they wouldn't even look at an application unless it was somebody with an existing lending relationship. It didn't matter that you might have had a checking account or a savings account with them forever. If you didn't have a loan with them, they wouldn't even look at your application. And we had, so many companies, small businesses that were locked out of that. And when you and I worked on this, I mean, this is the thing that pivoted me, right? Where I realized we need to be owning the banks. Like none of the efforts, they are all important, whether it be private prisons, whether it be voting rights, whether it be civil rights of all kinds, right? All of these issues matter, but none of them will stick if part of our strategy doesn't involve, at the end of this effort that we're all sort of collectively putting our brains and our muscles behind, if at the end of this, we don't end up with Latinx, Black, all communities of color, Indigenous folks, owning the banks, the insurance companies, the hospitals, the mortgage companies, like if we don't own the infrastructure of the economy, every piece of progress that we are seeing will just reverse because we're not in a position of owning the infrastructure of what powers our society. And so, yes. But listen, I promised that we would get back to the book. So let's pivot back to that. Impacto Real. I love the way that Ramphis pronounced it. First time I actually heard it in Spanish. Sí. There's a lag between, not a lag, but there was a window of time between when you published it in English and then when you published it in Spanish. So much has happened. I mean, look, the experience that you just described about being sued by the second largest private prison company in the US, like so much has happened between the publishing of English and Spanish. I'm curious both what changed in the industry and maybe even just like what changed for you, between then and now.
It's interesting. I think to some degree, knowing that a lot of impact investing is still developing, a lot really hasn't changed or is not changing quickly enough. So I think sometimes I get a little bit sad of, some ideas that I wish didn't feel innovative, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And at the same time, one of the things that I talk about in the book and that I take a lot of inspiration from, I grew up in Los Angeles, so casi Mexico, and went and lived in Mexico when I was 19, and then got to work for the UN in Honduras when I was in my mid-20s, and essentially I have just learned so much from Latin America. And that's, where I first learned about cooperatives and the idea of collective ownership and looking at the ejido structures that have been in Mexico like since the early 1900s, right? So I think what's interesting is that some of what's happening in impact investing is also the reviving of very old practices and indigenous practices. And that, from that perspective, they always say there's nothing new under the sun. But I think the ways that we can apply some of these principles more broadly to capital and then to take them to different institutions, right, is such a critical thing. So from that perspective, if anything, I've seen the movement in Latin America really grow. And that's part of why I really insisted on making sure that this came out in Spanish, that it was something that was really important to me. That particularly in the current fights that we've been doing, of making sure that there is greater engagement on this question of where is your money spending the night and what is the impact that it's having. So that being kind of the fundamental question of the book. And then also knowing that a lot of us come to money with a lot of trauma, right? Either that you didn't have it or you did have it, but that there's often reasons why we don't necessarily think this is going to be the most fun place to play to get to know what's happening on the investment side of the house. And I think one of the objectives of the book is to really make that conversation accessible and exciting. And I think from that perspective, that hopefully that does continue to feel fresh in the Spanish version as in the English version. It's really more about where someone is points in their social change trajectory, and when they're ready to really look money in the eye and say, I don't want you harming my community anymore, and here's what I can do about it, right? And here's how I can leverage money as a tool to shift power.
Yeah, and where our community, I think, is best suited in many ways, right? It's both the community where there's greatest opportunity for impact and growth and scale, right? There's 3 million of us in the United States alone, never mind Latin America. I'm curious as to why you think Latin Americans, or what we can do here. Let me shift the question. What can we do to make sure, because I'm a little bit inspired by what you said about the trauma, right? I think that communities of color, especially Latino communities, I mean, deuda, like there are few words in the Spanish language that will elicit such a negative response as the word deuda, like get me out, you know? And so, you know, I struggle with this a lot, right? When I work with founders, the idea of explaining that not all debt is bad, right? That there is such thing as debt that is not just good, but it's important. It's an important part of a balanced capital stack, for example, if you have a company. But we, and this is the part where I want to honor, as you say, empathy for the experience and the fact that this is coming from trauma. People that are nervous about debt, for example, are doing it for good reason. Like they're nervous because we as a community have been subjected to predatory loans. We as a community are still clawing back, not just from like decades of things like, you know, horrible student loans, but let's go way, way back. Let's talk about debt. You know, part of my family is from Ecuador. Ecuador was created from day one with a national debt to the United States that was so insurmountable, who knows if it will ever be paid. Right? That is from the founding first day of a nation, right? So we have many, many reasons to be nervous about these things. And so I guess my question to you is, it's not insurmountable, right? I'm Latina. I came to understand that, you know, debt can be good and it can be powerful, and that there are many different forms of capital beyond debt and VC and so many other alternatives. You know, a lot of the experiments and the innovation that you and your partner have been able to execute with the, what was it, over 90 investments that you've made?
Yes.
People are studying them. People are building case studies around them. Obviously, your book is full of them. What can we specifically do to get the Latinx community both behind this and also on the receiving end of these things? Like, what can we do sort of to take an active role to make sure that this is embedded into every aspect of who we are, and eventually so embedded that it becomes Latino, right? This is how we invest.
Sure.
This is what we do.
Right. And I think that really, from a cultural perspective, in terms of like the idea that we take care of people in the way we live our lives, that is a very Latino concept. Right. And that's where I feel really grateful from a young age. That's really like what I learned, was how to take care of other people and be a less selfish American. And I'm deeply grateful for that. Seriously. And I think that first and foremost, you know, going back to the idea that impact can be positive or negative, it is incumbent on us to make sure that our work is non-extractive, that is a fundamental principle in how we structure our investment transactions. We're looking at the balance between how much value stayed in a community versus how much came out. And that, I think, part of what I would kind of call financial racism that happens within impact investing is the idea of some projects that are good enough for those people. I talk, there's a chapter in the book talking about microfinance, right? And the idea that no idea is universally good or bad, it's how you execute it. And that in the case of, for instance, the IPO of Compartamos in Mexico, that, you know, if you had women who were used to getting 1,000% interest rates on debt from the local money lender, 300% sounded pretty good in their eyes, but that's still totally exploitative, right?
Right.
And we learned that even more so when you wound up having this massive IPO creating so much value off the backs of these women, right? So I think part of it is to say we need to be more thoughtful in how we structure this stuff, that nothing is exploitative necessarily unless you make it that way. So that's where we can't just port over traditional practices. We need to build new ones. And two examples of that One, Every Table in Los Angeles,
Mhm.
which provides healthy meals, usually at a $5 or less price point, all over Los Angeles, and has been largely serving Latino communities, and has outposts at community colleges, et cetera. They wanted to make sure, going back to ownership, and how franchisee ownership has been a source of
Mm.
wealth for communities of color, but often you need a lot of capital to start and it can feel very
Mhm.
high risk. They created a fund. It's so debt at around 2% to the investors,
Mm.
where basically it's no risk for the entrepreneurs, that they get trained in how to run one of the franchises. If
Mm.
that location doesn't work, they're able to get out and not owe anything.
Mm.
Which is pretty remarkable. So I think there's ways that you can structure that to make sure debt becomes an opportunity, like very
Yeah.
explicitly, and
Yeah.
and recognize who in the context of a transaction is in a position to take on more risk. Is it the investor who has a bunch of money or the entrepreneur who doesn't, right? Like let's be
Mhm.
clear on that. The other example that I was going to give, we recently invested, or rather are in process, with Collab Capital, which is out of Atlanta.
Mm.
It's 3 Black partners who were entrepreneurs, and essentially through their experience in navigating VC said, what if we really created VC in a way that works for Black folks? And that some of that might be doing revenue shares, as
Mhm.
opposed to expecting every company to become a billion-dollar company, knowing that there's a greater propensity sometimes for consumer products than for straight tech. Can you have a portfolio that has both of those things and creates new investment models? So we're really excited about funding that sort of innovation. And I think that you're going to see more of that, of Latino solutions for the Latino Latinx community, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's the sort of thing where, in being co-conspirators, right? Where we want to, in terms of the clients that we represent, make sure that we're as supportive of those initiatives as possible.
Let's talk about those examples are a perfect segue, I think, into two things. One that existed always, and then maybe the idea that perhaps it's shifted given the pandemic and also given the murder of George Floyd and all of the things that sort of ensued culturally here. This question of what is a return? What is what are concessionary returns? What are market returns? We talked sort of at the top of this about the idea that people sometimes confuse impact investing with one of two things, right? Either it's not ethical because you're trying to make an impact, but you're still making a profit. There's that sort of camp, and then there's obviously the camp that is, well, you're calling this an investment, but am I going to be able to make market returns? And I know that you often push back on even the framing of that, right? And I would love to visit that conversation, because I love it when the problem isn't in just the way people are seeing it, but the problem is even in the question, right?
Absolutely. So I think so we work with families, foundations, athletes, and influencers who want their money working for justice. And one of the first questions that we have to ask is, okay, given the amount of money that we have, is the amount that
Mhm.
we need more than that or less than that? And how did we get this money in the first place? Whose
Mhm.
back was it potentially built on or stolen from, right? And does that change how you think about what an appropriate return is, or a realistic
Mhm.
return, which is often how we'll express it? So, for instance, if I lead a pension fund and that's investing for teachers and other government workers, heck yeah, I need to make sure that those people can retire well, and I better make sure that the money is secure and I'm not taking a lot of risk, and I'm trying to grow it as much as possible. There
Yeah.
might be other cases. So, for instance, what they often call endowment style returns for foundations, because you're giving away 5% a year and you're going to have around 3% of operating, you probably care more about getting a really consistent 8% than you do about necessarily taking on more risk to try to get a higher return every time, right? So
Mhm.
I think American capitalism often pushes this more is always better,
Mhm.
which is just not true for a lot of people. And I even have, one client I work with, their objective was, I want to lose 20%. I actually think that, I have 20% more money than I need, and that it was potentially ill-gotten. And therefore I want to be thoughtful about how I can use it to really transfer power to communities. So I think that's part of it, is saying, let's be really clear that more is not always better, depending on you. Like, you might want more social change, right? What's your objective? Or if philanthropy is a negative 100% return, then a 2% return, if you get the same impact, that's like 102%. You know what I mean? That there's so much space in there to be more thoughtful. So I think that's important versus always assuming that we need to go for the highest return. We also need to think about the fact that most traditional finance institutions will say, okay, you want to do, more investing. Well, we can only support fund managers that have done 100 million in the past and have 10 years of track record. And we've had to push back and say, well, doesn't that mean you're getting ready to pretty much exclude all the women and people of color? And like, that's really not okay, not down with that. And that is a risk that we are not willing to take, right? So I think it's about risk has to be defined by everybody. And it goes back to, if financial market kind of policies and what's market rate and how risk is defined was largely determined by white men, doesn't mean that we need to have a broader conversation about who should finance be serving, and therefore what are returns that are reasonable. Because basically, to me, when I hear market returns, I'm like, oh, that's the market where we lock people up for profit and destroy the planet. I don't really like that market. That's not really where I want my money playing. I'm going to take my money over to this other market. And the only final thing that I would put into this conversation, which is at the same time, you see reports from pretty much every traditional finance institution. There was one 2 weeks ago from Chase. Harvard Business Review has done some 30-year studies. Companies that pay attention to the social and environmental impact of their work have historically majorly outperformed. And that Harvard study had twice the market cap over the last 30 years. So there's also this piece when people assume, and I think this is what you're getting to, Nathalie, of like, oh, if it's socially impactful, it can't make money, is actually potentially completely backwards. It's that if you ignore the social consequences, you're not going to make money dependably.
Yeah. Again and again, ESG investors, even in the public equities, they tend to dodge bullets here and there. You see these stories, right, where it's like they had kind of looked under the hood right before Nissan, took a bit of a dive. It just so happens a bunch of ESG portfolios had excluded Nissan from their portfolio, not because they knew exactly what was going to happen, but because they can smell. We can all smell when something is not quite right? And they had looked at the governance and something was funky, and sure enough, they were right? And then when that happened, all of these ESG portfolios were completely, they had dodged the bullet, right? And I think that we're going to see more and more of that all the time. What do you think is happening next? Like, just if in terms of future looking, do you have any predictions in the industry or any things that we should watch for?
Going back to that question of ownership, I feel also really good within the industry that I think you are starting to see much greater allocations to managers of color, women and people of color, and women of color who often, get lost in the intersectionality conversation. So I think, which
for the audience, we should set we're starting at less than 2% of money worldwide is managed by women or people of color, right? Who if we're just talking about people of color, represent 70% of the world. So 70% of the world manages less than 2% of the world's money. So when you say we're seeing a lot more allocations in that direction, there's a lot more to do, right? Like, we're starting from nearly zero.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think that is really impactful in terms of even trying to address some of the implicit bias that can really sit within investment decisions, and really paying attention to who is making those decisions and what are their values set and what is their lived experience and how do they contribute that. Second, this trend towards really experimenting with alternative ownership models, because I think the other thing we want to be careful of, people talk about sometimes the idea of don't just rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic of capitalism, right? That often if we're just focused on, and this is where I think the kind of trend towards saying diversity, equity, and inclusion, those really are three different things, right? So you could have a diverse portfolio in terms of supporting more entrepreneurs of color, but you're still only then going to create wealth for potentially one family, right? Unless you're thinking about, well, is that person also creating broader ownership opportunities for all the workers who are engaged?
Right.
Or sometimes we've used vehicles like a perpetual purpose trust, which makes something more broadly community owned than even just the workforce. So I think that sort of trend of saying, let's think more creatively about how do we broaden the economic impact is something that I'm really excited about. And then third, I would say people starting to really knock down what sometimes people call two-pocket thinking, that I do philanthropy over here and investing over here, and not really integrating the values across those. We're seeing a lot more institutions that are taking that a lot more intentionally. So I'm excited to see that, because I think that's really going to be necessary. That, you know, there's $3 trillion in capital markets circulating every day, and if we don't start harnessing the power of that, we're going to lose.
Question about our community, right? Among the Latinx community, one of the things that I love to talk about, right, and that I don't think people sort of take to heart, because you see so much out there around, like, let's encourage, you know, people of color, women of color, Latinas, African Americans to start businesses. But when you look at the data, women in the US are starting businesses, you know the stat, right? Twice the rate of men. And 8.9 out of 10 of those are started by women of color, which means that, again, Black women, Latina women, right? We are starting the majority of the new companies. No one needs to tell us and inspire us to be entrepreneurs. We are already the most entrepreneurial community in the nation. And so I guess my question for you is, how are there specific things that we can do to channel more capital towards this incredibly entrepreneurial demographic? But beyond that, are there metrics? Are there quotas, which I know is a controversial topic, right? Are there things that we should be setting as goals in order to do that? Because we can have conferences and conversations like this until we're blue in the face and talk about why money should be directed here and there. But how do we make sure that it happens? And what are the sort of goals we should be setting?
So three thoughts on that. First is, I think we need to do a better job of meeting diverse entrepreneurs where they are at, and with the types of businesses that people are starting all the time. And that often means, how do we make sure that, yes, there's a segment for people who want to start venture style tech businesses, but then also for those who want to make sure that their family business can actually be sustainable, can be something they can pass on to their kids. And that's where folks like Camino Financial in LA have been really transformative in broadening access to non-extractive finance, and you know, not needing to ask questions about immigration status, and making sure to be a much more open platform. So that's kind of one part of the funnel. And then second is that how do you broaden,
and on that funnel, just Morgan, just so everybody is aware, it's so important that there be that perspective beyond the VC, just because obviously that's hugely impactful for our community, but also people forget that VC represents 0.05% of all business financing. Like, I get it. They write all the articles, they're on TechCrunch, they're on the cover of Inc. and Fast Company, but like, let's just root this in reality, which is they're a teeny tiny niche.
Yes. And I think also the importance, you know, part of kind of personal sovereignty, family sovereignty is deciding how much do you want to work, you know, and the assumption that like bigger is always better, that may not always be true for people, right? It might be that they really want something where I get to work 6 hours and then I go pick up my kid from school. And that's actually what's most important to me, right? But I think, so the second segment though, there may be some who say, I actually do want to turn this into a chain, or I'm seeing that some technology I'm using, you know, really could be scalable and sustainable. So
or
I
I'm
think
Nina
it's making sure,
and I want to have $1 billion company. That is the fastest growing woman-owned company in the United States. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think that's where making sure that all those different flavors of money are available, and that we need to think about that in terms of like, how do we create a broader set of opportunities and let everyone be their special snowflake, right? In terms of the type of businesses that they want to start, right? Versus like capital forcing people into what they want it to be, right? So I think that's one piece to it. Oh man, that's the problem. That's why I said at the beginning, I was like, there's three things, so that I would remember the 3 points that I wanted to cover.
I talked about metrics. Maybe that was one piece. Metrics, numbers, goals.
Oh, thank you. The goals
Yeah.
piece. Yes. So I think another piece that's really interesting, when I started this out, I mentioned we had 90 investments, 125 million, majority to women and people of color. For many years, we actually didn't even talk about like diversity stats because the main thing on our masthead isn't we support diverse founders. The main thing we talk about is we support entrepreneurs that know their communities and therefore are going to do the best work, right? So I think we also have to be careful, depending on the context. I think that for institutions that have done nothing right in this area, having concrete goals, from a what gets measured gets managed perspective becomes important. But I think also going back to what you were saying of like, wait a minute, like why would you even need to set that sort of quota if like 8.9 out of 10 businesses are being started by women of color anyway, right? If I repeated that correctly. So I think it more goes back to if you address the implicit bias in your practices, would that shift who you are investing in, right? Because otherwise, I think sometimes we can get into this pattern of saying, oh, well, then a fear of will that fall more into a conversation of saying, oh, this person only got invested into because they're a person of color, whereas opposed to saying, we invest in the best entrepreneurs possible who are serving their communities well. And by the way, that is going to over-index to people of color. That is what we have found in our work. But because we know that there needs to be greater accountability about that, the gap between rhetoric and conversation, we now have in the last couple of years started to make sure that we're clearer on our metrics. So last year, our investments were actually over 75% in the communities of color and over 20 million just last year to Black, Latinx, and Indigenous led organizations. So yes, it's all important. Is what it comes down to.
All of it. I want to be sure that I'm conscientious of time. Ramphis, I know that you were going to let us know, but I'm just going to do a quick check-in. Are we good on time, or do we need to open up to Q&A? Because Morgan and I can keep talking forever, obviously.
I think we have 15 left, so it could be a good time.
Okay, great. I'm not seeing the chats, so do we want to switch to questions? And if so, do we want to bring Ramphis up to help us curate some of the ones that have come up? And maybe as the questions come up, Morgan, you just mentioned, and as we bring Ramphis up, you mentioned the stats even just over the last year, the 20 million invested, the founder representation. I mean, those are stats that very few investors can claim. Did you set those goals upfront, or did it just happen?
It really just happened. I mean, I think it goes back to, I think we've made efforts to be in strong community. So I think one of the things, pipeline is such, where do you find your opportunities? And I think it's the same for grant makers of how are you, going beyond the usual suspects and knowing that even in the context of like philanthropy, there's a great article by Vanessa Daniels on, I think it's similarly less than 1% of philanthropy goes to women of color led organizations, right? So these are very parallel issues in terms of the funding differential in who is actually executing the work, right, most of the time versus who is actually getting funded. So I think that because that has always been so apparent to me, it was really principal to how we build our firm. Even like I mentioned, the fact that we're co-located with activists in downtown Oakland, as opposed to sitting on the 40th floor of a Manhattan high-rise, which is what most investors would do, right? Of how do you really put yourself out there in a way to make sure that you're getting access and gaining trust, right? And some of that is making sure that diversity and equity practices are within our team as well. Of that being a really critical component. So at any rate, I think it's the sort of thing where any institution is built towards its objectives. And the extent to which our objective has been to invest in the entrepreneurs who are doing best by their communities, we essentially had to build an entire practice around that theme. And I guess what I would say, what's changed for us in the last couple of years, we had started off just working with 2 families. And that over time, we started to hear from the entrepreneurs when we were surveying them on how could we help more? And they were like, you need to bring more investors, right? Like we need to scale more. And that's when we started to be more open to working with more people. So now we have a larger community of foundations and families that when they say, I think there's also this gap sometimes from an infrastructure perspective in the field that if you decide that you want to align your money and your values, who do you call? Right? Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
So I think we're being more open to answering that call for people and helping them really think through. For instance, the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, who we work with, that they came to us saying, we want to devote a specific pool of funds to fund managers of color and help us figure out, how many funds we should do, what stages, geographic, et cetera. So kind of constructing a strategy and then getting those assets out the door and deployed in community. So I think there is this element of going back to Nathalie's outcomes over optics, that once you decide that you want to get to a certain state, you have to put some things in motion to make that happen.
Yeah. And I will say it is
back with us.
Yeah, good. Welcome back, Ramphis. It's outcomes over optics. It's not outcomes, not optics, right? Because I think that having you, it's just faced with the choice between writing a random ass press release that just, gets you some PR, but doesn't actually amount to doing anything for the community. Please choose the outcomes, rather than the optics. But it doesn't mean that you, one precludes the other. And I think it's important, Morgan, that you be in meetings like this, that you have conversations with communities, that people read your book, that, that we do actually do the work of educating communities about this, alternative way of functioning, which should be the mainstream way of functioning. And, you've been really good, Morgan, at building coalitions and at being a part of coalitions. I know that, you and I are involved in taking the birth control pill over the counter for the first time in history, which will hopefully happen over the next, year or two. And that was a coalition. That was a coalition that we built with like-minded investors who think like us, who care about issues. Nobody is going to benefit more from an over-the-counter birth control pill than Latinas and African-American women, right? And that's, that's the true north, right? And so you've just been an amazing both leader of coalitions and participant in other people's coalitions. So speaking of coalitions, you two sent me a beautiful photo that gave me FOMO a year ago when you were in Puerto Rico together. So Ramphis, you're a part of the coalition. Tell us, what are people asking?
Yeah. So as some of the questions come in, one question, and first off, this has been just incredible, right? I mean, I could hear you both just speak forever. One of the questions is, earlier, Morgan, you were mentioning how investing and activism go together, and you sort of mentioned how as people transition on their journey, aligning their values with their investing, there's different reactions and different folks react to it in different ways. So my question is, you've shared on the investing side what's been done. I'm curious on the activism side around investing, right? In terms of, has there been any conversations on breach of fiduciary duty, right? If you're under investing in the best performing founders, best performing managers that happen to be from underrepresented backgrounds, is there conversations around how do we embed and talk about activism in the context of shifting how investment happens and how the conversations happen that such a gets made in these rooms?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting is the political advocacy potential in how investments are governed. And to give two examples of that, people may have heard of PRI's, program-related investments, where you have to kind of get an exemption from the IRS to be able to do these sorts of things. And it's not that difficult. It's just like a letter from a lawyer. It's no big deal. And at the same time, the fact that you have to, as a foundation, right? So let's presume that foundation assets have been set aside and receive special tax status because they are supposed to fulfill a social purpose. So going back to this example, if I'm a foundation that works on immigration rights, the idea that I need to get an exemption potentially if I want to fund immigration bonds, right? The type of project that I think Freedom for Immigrants had been putting together. I might need to get an exemption for that. But I don't need an exemption if I want to invest my money in the private prisons that are locking up the immigrants. Like, wait a minute, like, isn't that totally backwards, right? Like, shouldn't I actually need an exemption to invest in a way that's not aligned with the values of the institution? In the same way that I'm not allowed to give the foundation's philanthropy to the board member's sister, right? That there's reasons why there's governance around philanthropic assets. So in that same way, it's been interesting to see, can there be kind of a more thoughtful environment around what should be the guardrails for what philanthropy actually is allowed to invest in. So that's one. Second, the CRA policies, Community Reinvestment Act, right? That is about addressing redlining. That often has been about just getting money into particular zip codes, or similarly with opportunity zones, right? Of really focused on just the geographic area. But that meant that I'm forgetting right now if it was Portland or Seattle, but in the Northwest, let's say, opportunity zone funds were used to build Ritz-Carlton apartments, right? And is that benefiting communities of color? Like maybe a really tiny slice. So at any rate, it goes back to, can we make sure that these sorts of programs that are supposed to be catalyzing investment into communities are actually reaching the intended beneficiaries? I think, and same with the PPP, right? So I think it goes back to always looking at who are programs reaching, and if they're not, who has this vested interest and things continuing otherwise. That's a space where we can actually use philanthropy and the power of philanthropic institutions to kind of shift rivers. It's kind of like thinking about putting a dam to like make that money make a left turn actually towards communities as opposed to flowing out.
Yeah, I would add that there's also a really great opportunity around enforcement, right? There are laws already that say that you cannot discriminate in banking. There are laws already that say that there are a lot of things that shouldn't be happening, but when we look at the data, it is clearly not being enforced. And so I think it's an interesting time, especially with the new administration, for us to start thinking about simply demanding that the existing laws be enforced, and they be enforced aggressively.
Right. Well, and that's where, you know, one of those elements of implicit bias is the idea that rules, when enforced, quote unquote, neutrally, but have a discriminatory outcome, right? So the idea of saying, oh, well, saying that you have to have 100 million a track record, that's got nothing to do with race, right? Right?
Oops.
So, right. So I think that's where we need to really be explicit in naming that you have the invisible hand of money, but you also have the invisible hands of race and gender. And the more that we can name how that is working throughout the finance system, we can start to advocate for different outcomes.
Just to sharing one of the questions from the audience, Josh Wilson says, so within the investing communities in the 80s, deregulation is the elephant in the room. Is there any focus on reversal? Right? It says, as deregulation benefited the finance sector, and any focus on a reversal. As an example, mortgage deregulation strangles so much.
Absolutely. So I think that is part of the policy advocacy environment that's so critical right now, and that's where we do have power as investors. And I include foundations as investors, right, within that conversation, to be both funding the advocacy and then executing the advocacy, right? That it really does make a difference in the coalition work that we've been doing with grassroots activists. And it'd be interesting in kind of looking through your philanthropic portfolios through this lens. Is there a circumstance, like we just supported a letter going to the Biden administration saying that you need to end the use of for-profit prisons also in the immigrant detention system, not just the Department of Justice. You can have a letter like that that says we represent millions of people, and that's very powerful. You can have a letter that says we represent millions of people and X trillions of dollars. And that is powerful in a different way, right? And I think we often forget, like, oh wait, I sit at a foundation. You can have a letter that says we represent millions of people and X trillions of dollars. So is that a resource that is offering to your grantees, right? As part of this conversation, I think is really critical.
I love those numbers, because a number that is one of my favorite ones that my team brought to me earlier this year is that if the African American and Latino community shopped with each other, banked with each other, built an economy that supported each other, we would have an economy the size of $3.9 trillion. It would be the fourth largest economy in the world if we just got together and supported one another.
I think it's a really critical piece, and it goes back to that money trauma question of this feeling of, oh, these are poor communities, is just completely backwards, right? In terms of one, recognizing that beyond even like cultural and solidarity power, but really the power of the actual money that is passing and flowing out of communities all the time, that's where I think we also have the opportunity through impact investing to really help grow those internal networks.
I would start kind of jump in we're actually kind of running on time, and I could hear people, I would say, forever. And I just wanted to, Nathalie, leave you with if you have a final question for Morgan, and then we can kind of wrap.
¿Por qué en español? ¿Por qué te pareció tan importante que se traduzca el libro?
Claro que sí. Bueno, una cosa fue que fue bien importante para mí, como de mi historia personal, y otro que en los años que muchas de las prácticas de Latinoamérica que me han inspirado y que escribí tanto en el libro Los Ejemplos de Latinoamérica. Entonces, yo también veo una potencial económica bien fuerte en toda Latinoamérica y por lo que he visto, no hay tantos recursos para que la gente aprenda las prácticas. Y entonces fue una cosa que quería dar mi contribución en ese sentido. Y he estado dando muchas prácticas sobre eso. Voy a usar el martes por la mañana, 8:30 EST en Univision, hablando de esos temas también. Y yo creo que es bien importante que llevamos esa práctica, pero también ese potencial, ese poder a la comunidad latina también.
Me encanta que acabamos esta conversación en español. Creo
Como
que
debe
me
ser.
encantaría otra vez
Claro que sí.
esta conversación completamente en español, ¿verdad? Me encantaría invitarlas a ambas y traerlo, porque en el PowerUp Fund de Hispanics in Philanthropy, y cambiando un poco inglés, the PowerUp Fund focus and purpose is to have more of this information be out there for others, right? This is, you've been at this 20 years, there's a lot of players, there's a lot of things happening, and we want more of that to be accessible to everyone that cares about aligning their values with their investing. So just want to be thankful for your time, all the gems that have been shared, and I just super appreciative, really for everyone on this conversation. You can find Morgan and Nathalie on Twitter. You can follow them at Morgan Simon 1 on Twitter, Morgan Simon 1, and Nathalie Molina, Nathalie Molina, Nathalie Molina. And it's Nathalie Molina Niño, and can share with others. And her book, LEAPFROG, and you can also find on Amazon. We'll share these notes for everyone kind of after the conversation. Again, thank you both for the time, effort, energy, inspiration. We're excited to just really take a lot of nuggets shared, put them into action, and look forward to maybe having a Spanish conversation about the book itself and having you both back.
Cuando quieras.
Gracias. Thank you, Morgan. Always.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I would just throw out for people who are kind of looking at this journey, if you have questions, if you want support, I drop my email in there too. Like, love helping people find their way through, and tend to do a lot of, for instance, like book talks with foundation boards, and creating kind of safe spaces for people to be able to ask questions around what they can do. So really happy to support those conversations, and also excited to fund more Latino entrepreneurs. So if you have entrepreneurs, fund managers who are seeking capital, please do send them our way as well. So thank you.
Absolutely.